One of the first steps when creating a cut flower garden is figuring out what you have to work with. You can grow cut flowers in almost any amount of space, and in this chapter, I'm going to help you assess your site and figure out how to make the most of what you have, whether that's a raised bed, a planter, or growing in the ground. The first thing to do when assessing your site is to just take a slow walk around and really look at what you have to work with. So not everybody has a big field or a big backyard to grow their flowers in, but if you don't have a lot of space, don't get discouraged. We're going to think outside the box. I've seen so many gardens built in the most unlikely spaces. I've seen fire escapes in the city transformed into a cut flower garden in pots and containers. I've seen old driveways and abandoned tennis courts transformed into gardens using raised beds. A lot of people take the strip between where they park their car and the sidewalk, and that makes a great spot for growing cut flowers. So even if you don't have a lot of ground to grow in, if you really get creative, there are so many possibilities available, and we're going to go through what some of those are. So no matter where you choose to grow your garden, it's really important that it gets plenty of sunlight. So cut flowers need at least 6 hours minimum of bright, direct sunlight to thrive. Ideally, you'd give them more than that, but you need at least 6. So the way to check that is to actually just watch the space that you're considering. You need to do it on a nice sunny day so that you can see where the path of the sun goes, but just have a little piece of paper and write down when does the sun hit that area, and then when does the sun leave. And then you just add up the amount of hours total that the sun was shining on that spot, and that's how much light you have to work with. So just make sure it's 6 and you're good. So if you don't have any sun to work with, if all you have is shade, you can still grow flowers in that area, but it's not going to be the ones you grow from seed. You're going to have to rely on perennials and shrubs that thrive in the shade. So a couple of other things that you want to keep in mind when you're looking at potential garden spots. The first is you want to avoid any area where you've got a lot of root systems. So if you've got a big tree in your backyard or you've got a hedge and you can see roots running along the ground, those roots are going to compete with your cut flowers and pull water and nutrients from the soil. They're going to be really hard to work around. So if that's the only spot that you have that has good sunlight, then rather than planting in the ground, you're going to want to build raised beds. And if you have an area that you're considering that has really crummy soil or is a drain field, or you have a lot of standing water and you can't actually grow in the ground, another great alternative is to build raised beds, or you can put a whole collection of containers. And finally, every climate is different, and so to figure out what is going to do really well in your area or anything that you really need to keep in mind when you're growing in your location, there are 2 great resources. So you've got your local master gardeners that you can ask them for advice anytime, and your local nurseries and garden centers. The folks that work there are super knowledgeable and can advise you on your specific climate. All right, so let's get started assessing our site. So I've got a couple of spaces that I want to grow cut flowers in. I've got my big backyard where I'm going to do beds in the ground, and then I've got a couple of other spots where I think I might need to use containers. So here in front of my chicken coop, it's kind of boring looking, and I want to spice it up a little bit. But the ground here is really hard. It's got gravel, so I can't actually plant in the dirt. I have to figure out how much space do I have to work with so I can see how big of a container I can fit in this spot. Okay, so roughly 4 feet, I'd say by 4 by 4. That'd be pretty big, but it would fit here. And you can also see that I've got a lot of shade here right now, but I've been keeping an eye on this spot, and I know that in the morning it doesn't get any sun, but by lunchtime all the way to sunset, there is beautiful bright sunlight, so plenty of light to grow cut flowers. And then on the walkway heading out to the garden, this used to be a road. So the ground is very hard and compact, and I don't think it would be great to try to grow in ground. So I think a raised bed would actually be ideal here. So process is the same. I'm just going to figure out how much room I have to work with. Let's see, probably about here. So I could go as wide as 4 feet. Okay, let's see how long. Now I don't have to use all this space. Like I don't have to build it this big. I just want to know what I could fill if I wanted to. I'd say 8 feet is about the max. I'd want to go long. Be a really nice bed. So no matter where you are planting, whether it's like out in a big garden, on a patio, on a fire escape, like no matter where you're going to be putting your flowers, the process is the same. You just want to like note and measure and record what you have to work with, so when we go to plan, you know how much space you have. I'm out here in my back garden, and this is the spot I've chosen to plant a little cutting garden so I can have some flowers for our kitchen table. So I chose this spot because it gets sun all day long. The soil is in really good shape and it's freely draining. So next step is to measure out, kind of give a ballpark sense of what I'm going to be working with. So I'm going to measure out the corners. All right, so now I've got it marked off and I can see kind of like what's in my mind. And the next step is to measure it and write it down. So since we're on a farm, I do a lot of measuring and I have a measuring wheel, but you certainly don't need one of those to do this project. You can just use a tape measure. So I'm gonna measure off the corners and mark it down in my notebook. 20. Okay, so now that I've got my space marked off, it's about 20 by 20 feet, which is really kind of a perfect square. And in this space, I can fit 4 or 5 planting beds, so a lot of cut flowers. So now that I've got the measurements taken from my potential growing spaces, my big garden, my planter, and raised bed, I'm going to transfer the measurements that I took in my notebook to actual graph paper. And then I can start kind of picturing and dreaming up what I want to do in each area and figure out how many plants I can fit in my containers and beds. Okay, so I've got 20 by 20, square like it is. Okay, so that's like the edges of my garden. And then I'm gonna break it up. I think I'm gonna do, I could do my beds about 3 feet wide. Let's go 1, and then a 2-foot path. 1, 2, 3, 4, okay. So this isn't gonna be perfect and it's not meant to be perfect. This is just, we're just kind of sketching out some potential layouts. And since I'm so visual, I always have to see like what I'm imagining drawn out and written down. Otherwise it doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I'm gonna color these in. I'm gonna consider these my paths. Okay, so for my 20 by 20 garden, let me just put the measurements. So it's 20 feet here, 20 feet there. And then that's a nice size cutting garden. I can get a lot of baby plants in that space. And I think that's pretty perfect for what I want out of that spot. But not everybody has a space that big. So then let's draw out my chicken coop and raised bed. Just gonna draw in where the door was. Okay, so that's gonna be the door. 4 feet this way by 4 feet that way. And I think that's actually going to fit a whiskey barrel pretty perfectly. And then I've also got that spot for a raised bed. So I've got about 8 feet by 4, but I don't think I want it to be quite that big. That's the max amount of space I have to use. So I think I'm going to do it a little smaller, maybe a little bit more narrow. So what if I think I'll go about 2 feet wide by maybe 7 feet long, so it doesn't take up my whole space. We're gonna go 7 by 2. Okay, so now that I've got these marked out, I can start figuring out how many plants I can actually fit in the beds and containers. When it comes to growing annual cut flowers, you can actually space your plants a lot closer together than you think. The benefits of close plant spacing are that you can get more plants per bed. Because the plants are more crowded, they're going to reach for the sun and make longer stems, which are great for cutting. And because the plants are so tight in the bed, there's not going to be a lot of room for weeds. So here at Floret, we space our plants really close together, about 9 inches apart, and we plant in grids in each bed. And it doesn't matter if I'm planting in the ground, in containers, or raised beds, I apply that same approach to everything that I'm doing. And I'm going to take that and apply it to my raised bed and my planter. So here's the calculation to figure out how many plants you can fit in a bed. So for these beds, they're 20 feet long. So I'm going to take that 20 feet and I'm going to times it by 12 inches. So that gives me the total number of inches that I have to work with, which is 240. Then I'm going to take my total number of inches and divide that by 9 because that's how far apart I want to space my plants. And that gives me roughly 26 plants per row. Now I can fit 4 rows in each bed, so I'm going to take 26 times 4, and that gives me about 104 plants per bed, which is a crazy amount of plants in just one bed. In this chapter, we went over how to assess your growing space, noting sun exposure, areas you might want to avoid, and how to think outside the box. We then measured and marked out potential growing spaces and calculated how many plants would fit in each. You can grow so many cut flowers in even the smallest of spaces if you just get creative.